In 1985, a yellow school bus left Cedar Creek Elementary just after sunrise. On board were 14 children, excited, talkative, backpacks bouncing on the vinyl seats, as they set off on what was supposed to be a routine school trip to the nearby Silver Pine Mountains, a 2-hour drive, lunch by the lake, back before sunset. That was the plan. They never came back. What happened next would become one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in the region's history. The kind that still echoes through quiet towns, passed down in whispers, still feared even now. Before we continue, comment where you are watching from. The weather that day had been strange from the start. Local reports said a low-pressure system had swept in unexpectedly. Dense fog clung to the tree lines and slid between the valleys like something alive. One ranger later described it as thicker than smoke, like driving through wet concrete. Radio signals grew weak. Some channels went dead entirely. At 9:47 a.m., the last confirmed radio communication came from the driver, Gerald Finley, who calmly stated, "Visibility's getting bad, slowing down now." That was it. By 11 o'clock, the school began calling the driver. No answer. Other chaperones tried too. Silence. The group was expected back at 4:15 p.m. By 5:30, parents had gathered in the parking lot, pacing. Some assumed the trip had run long, but by 6 o'clock, it wasn't worry anymore. It was panic. Old photos flicker into memory. The class picture from earlier that year, 14 children lined up in neat rows, some grinning, others squinting into the sun. Someone would later tape that photo to a telephone pole, with the words "missing" handwritten in red across the top. By nightfall, the police were involved. Helicopters were dispatched. State troopers set up roadblocks. But the forest offered nothing. Not a single tire mark. No broken branches. No debris. It was as if the bus had been erased mid-journey. The school district scrambled for answers, but their route logs were outdated and incomplete. Rumors swirled. Was the bus hijacked? Was the driver drunk? Did they get lost and crash somewhere deeper in the woods? No theory had evidence. No theory gave closure. And with every hour that passed, the worst possibilities became harder to ignore. The parents weren't just grieving. They were furious. They accused the school board of negligence, of covering something up. Fights broke out at town meetings. One board member resigned. But none of it brought the children back. Within weeks, Cedar Creek went from a quiet mountain town to a place defined by loss. Storefronts put up yellow ribbons that never came down. Teachers transferred to other districts. The next year's class trip was canceled indefinitely. Families moved away. Some couldn't even bring themselves to drive past the school anymore. A rusty school bus, 14 missing children, and a fog-covered road that no longer appeared on maps. It was a ghost story now, but one built on real names, real faces, and real grief. And 40 years later, the forest finally gave something back. Before we continue, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from. Let's see how far this mystery travels, and how many of you are still out there listening. Because what happens next changes everything. By the morning after the disappearance, Cedar Creek was in chaos. Parents hadn't slept. The school parking lot was still full. Cars idling, headlights on, coffee going cold in trembling hands. Teachers cried in the hallway. The local sheriff, Tom Lyle, stood in front of a dozen news cameras and said what no one wanted to hear. "We don't know where they are, but we're going to find them." The search began immediately. It would become the largest coordinated search effort in state history. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dipping low over the thick pine canopy. Dozens of volunteers combed through muddy ditches and narrow deer trails, their feet sinking into soft moss. K-9 units were brought in from 3 counties. Rangers marked off grids with orange flags. The National Guard even offered support. But nothing. No wreckage, no tire tracks, no scent trail. Nothing except a single child's glove, found snagged on a thorn bush near a ravine, 20 miles from the original route. It belonged to a girl named Haley Gardner. Her mother confirmed it instantly from a photo shown on the evening news. That tiny fabric detail was the only physical proof they had that the bus had even existed beyond the school gates. Old footage plays in your mind like a documentary. Parents gathered in front of City Hall, holding up school portraits, their voices cracking. "Please, if you've seen anything at all." One man shouts, barely holding it together, "Just bring our babies home." Conspiracy theories began forming almost instantly. Some claimed the bus had been hijacked. Others said it had driven into an old mine shaft, swallowed by the earth. People talked about the Lost Road, a stretch of pavement built decades ago for logging trucks that had since been absorbed by the forest and removed from maps. Some even whispered about things older than roads, things the forest itself remembered. But the official stance remained clinical. The state's final report labeled the incident an environmental accident. They suggested the driver had taken a wrong turn in the fog, veered off-road, and crashed in a way that made the vehicle difficult to locate, possibly submerged in a lake or buried in a landslide. "We may never know," the governor said at a press conference. The phrase became a bitter mantra among the grieving. But the families, especially those who had lost more than one child, refused to accept it. They formed their own search groups. One father spent over $30,000 of his savings chartering private flights, scanning from above with outdated maps and a pair of binoculars. Another mother walked a 10-mile loop through the woods every Sunday, placing a white ribbon on every tree she passed. Weeks turned into months, then years. The ribbons faded, the news vans disappeared, the names of the missing faded from public memory, but not from the families. Even decades later, when children grew up and Cedar Creek was just a name on a map again, those families remembered. The grief didn't age, it calcified. There were no graves to visit, no closure, just 14 empty chairs that never got filled. And yet, despite the silence, some parents said they still felt watched. That parts of the forest felt wrong when they visited. That on some nights, if the wind hit the house just right, they could hear something outside, the faint sound of laughter, of tires crunching gravel. The official narrative closed the case, but the forest hadn't spoken yet. And after 40 years, it finally did. For the families left behind, time didn't pass the way it did for the rest of the world. News headlines shifted, new students filled the classrooms of Cedar Creek Elementary, and the seasons cycled on. But for the parents of the 14 missing children, everything stopped on that fog-drenched morning in 1985. Grief calcified into daily life. The dinner table stayed set for those who never returned. Birthdays came and went like cruel reminders. No graduations, no wedding speeches, only silence, dead air where laughter once echoed. Two families, in particular, the Marshalls and the Keens, became synonymous with the tragedy. Jim and Renee Marshall had twin daughters on that bus. Over time, their home turned into a makeshift operations center. Their living room walls were covered in pinned-up newspaper clippings, route maps, Post-it notes, and blurry photos. Red string ran from clue to clue in a mosaic of obsession. A calendar with over 1,000 marked-off days showed just how long they'd been at this. Jim quit his job and committed himself fully to decoding what had gone wrong. Renee saved everything, every voicemail, flyer, anonymous tip. She even monitored shortwave radio frequencies, hoping to catch a whisper in the static. The Keenas, Marjorie and Glenn, chose a different path. Glenn knocked on doors across the county for years, revisiting every local who might have seen something, anything, on the day the bus vanished. A few swore they'd glimpsed something yellow in the distance, swallowed by fog. But no one was sure. Marjorie tracked every account meticulously in dozens of binders, all color-coded by year. When the leads dried up, she started writing letters to retired detectives, out-of-state park rangers, and even seasoned hunters who frequented the mountains. One reply stood out, dated 2003, typed on worn stationery. It read, "You're not crazy. I heard it too." No return address, just a name, Thompson, and a blurred thumbprint at the bottom. There were other things Marjorie kept to herself. Until now. For 2 straight years after the disappearance, every Thursday night at exactly 11:11 p.m., she heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. Always the same pattern, always the same time. Glenn said it was animals. Her therapist called it grief, but Marjorie was sure. She never opened the door. She was too afraid of what or who might be standing there. Then there was Ethan Caldwell. He was 7 years old in 1985 and had been scheduled to join the school trip. But a fever kept him home. In the decade since, he's struggled with something even harder to explain than survivor's guilt. Recurring dreams. Always the same. A rust-covered school bus deep in the woods, windows fogged, branches growing up through its roof like nature had tried to erase it. Inside, the faint outlines of children pressed against the glass. They never spoke, but they always knocked. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan tried therapy. He journaled. He avoided the area completely. But the dreams persisted. He says they evolved over time. When he turned 35, the children in the visions began waving. Not in a friendly way. Their hands moved in slow, synchronized patterns. Their faces were always just out of clarity, not blurred, but wrong, as if his mind was actively preventing him from remembering what they truly looked like. One night, he says, he heard one of them whisper his name. Other unexplained things happened over the years, too. The Marshalls noticed power outages in their home, always on the same date, October 22nd. The girl's bedroom door would creak open in the middle of the night, even though it had been locked. Toys were found, moved. Batteries inside things long dead would suddenly work again. At first, they laughed it off. Then they stopped laughing. And eventually, they stopped talking about it altogether. Through it all, the families never moved. Not the Marshalls, not the Keens, not Ethan. As if their roots were too deep, or like they feared that leaving would somehow let the memory fade. Because to them, the case wasn't closed, not even close. And then, nearly 40 years after the school bus vanished, something surfaced. Cedar Creek's quiet would be shattered in a way no one could prepare for. The forest was different back then. That's what people always said. Before the fires in the late 1980s, before the park closures, and long before anyone thought to digitize the terrain into GPS coordinates, there were trails that only locals knew. Roads that had no names. Paths etched by hunters, loggers, and in some stories, things older than towns. But in the summer of 2012, 27 years after the children vanished, a group of hikers stumbled across something they weren't meant to find. They were 3 men in their early 30s, friends from college who'd made it a yearly tradition to explore forgotten places with only paper maps and memory. They were deep in the northern ridge of what used to be part of Gray Pine National Forest, a region closed off for decades due to dangerous erosion and unstable soil left behind by wildfires in 1986. There were faded, no trespassing signs nailed to trees, half swallowed by bark, long ignored by thrill seekers. It started with one of them spotting an odd line in the woods. Not a trail exactly, but a stretch of flattened vegetation that moved in a straight line, almost unnaturally so. The trees on either side leaned just slightly inward, like they had grown around something that used to pass through them. Curious, they followed it. The deeper they walked, the quieter the forest became. Birdsong faded. Even the buzzing of insects seemed to vanish. The light changed too, less dappled sunlight, and more of a dull, greenish cast. One of them remarked it felt like they had walked into a place that forgot it was part of the rest of the world. After almost a mile of silent hiking, the path curved slightly uphill and opened into what looked like a clearing, except it wasn't fully open. Trees still surrounded the area, but the underbrush had been cleared long ago, replaced with thin moss and compacted dirt. That's when they saw it. Twin grooves in the earth, nearly fossilized into stone. They ran parallel, perfectly spaced, too wide for a car. But the kind of spacing you'd see from something bigger, longer, like a bus. They followed the grooves with their eyes until they disappeared beneath a thick tree whose roots curled out of the ground like fingers. It was there that one of them noticed something glinting in the afternoon light. Half buried in the bark of that gnarled old tree, roughly 5 feet off the ground, was a curved shard of metal. They had to pry it out with a pocket knife. The object was corroded but unmistakable. A convex mirror, shattered but still vaguely intact, its backing yellowed and cracked. And on the reverse, faint but visible under the grime, were the ghostly remnants of painted lettering. The letters O-L, and the bottom half of what might have been a B or U. One of the men laughed nervously and said, "Holy asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. That's a school bus mirror." They took photos, GPS coordinates, made jokes about ghosts. But when they returned to town and tried to show someone, the Park Service, a forest ranger, anyone, no one believed them. That area, they were told, had been burned out and closed for decades. No vehicles had been allowed up there since the early 90s. No bus could have gotten in. No official roads even went that far anymore. A few weeks later, the photos they took? Corrupted. Blank black thumbnails. One file was still readable, just one. It showed the three of them standing in the clearing. Behind them, barely noticeable unless zoomed in, was a shape in the tree line. Not an animal. Not quite a person. Just a tall figure, vague and out of focus, standing between two trees. One of the hikers refused to go back. Another did, alone, 6 months later. He returned quiet, pale, and unwilling to talk about what he saw. All he would say was, "It's not gone, it was never gone." Around the same time, a local logger working on the edge of the forest reported something strange. He found an old road grader abandoned near a dried creek bed. Nearby, half buried under roots and vines, was what looked like an old license plate. He took it home, cleaned it, and posted it to an online forum for vintage vehicle collectors. Within hours, someone messaged him and asked where he found it. The license plate matched the one registered to a school district vehicle reported missing in October 1985. Whispers started again. Articles resurfaced. The Cedar Creek case, cold for decades, appeared in regional papers under the headline, "Could the bus be buried in the forest?" Locals began hiking that section again, some driven by curiosity, others by internet fame. TikTok users made videos walking into the trees, whispering urban legends about the unmarked road. One video claimed you could hear children laughing if you stayed long enough. Another, darker one, showed a group standing in the clearing at sunset. In the last frame, a high-pitched screech cut through the audio, followed by static. The video was deleted 3 days later. Meanwhile, the families watched in silence. Some were angry, furious at the idea that their children's disappearance had become some kind of viral ghost story. Others were quiet, haunted by the idea that maybe, just maybe, Something real had been found. And if that was true, if the road was real and the grooves weren't coincidence, then what did that mean for the children? More importantly, what else might still be waiting at the end of that unmarked road? In the spring of 2025, a small team of environmental researchers from a nearby university was conducting a drone-based mapping project over the northern sector of Gray Pine Forest, the same region where hikers had once reported finding a rusted mirror embedded in a tree trunk. Their task was simple: survey land erosion and canopy health using high-resolution thermal and LiDAR-equipped drones. Nothing about their mission had anything to do with the Cedar Creek disappearance, but what they stumbled upon would change everything. It started with a patch of forest that looked off. On the surface, everything seemed natural. Healthy tree cover, scattered underbrush, the sort of remote growth untouched for decades. But when processed through LiDAR, one anomaly jumped out. Beneath the dense tree canopy, wedged awkwardly between two limestone ridges, the scanner picked up a shape too geometric to be natural: a rectangular body, approximately 40 feet long, hollow inside. At first, they assumed it might be an abandoned shipping container or a buried trailer. But the closer they looked, the more undeniable the silhouette became. Rounded edges, understructure consistent with a vehicle frame. One of the students, reviewing the render on his tablet, mumbled a word that hadn't been spoken seriously in years: bus. Within days, a team of rangers and investigators was assembled. Using manual tools and light excavation gear, being careful not to collapse the surrounding soil, they made their way through the forest to the coordinates. It wasn't easy. The ravine had long since closed in, covered in decades of pine growth and moss. But the shape had not moved. And by the second day of clearing, they hit yellow. Sun-faded, mud-caked, cracked in long, jagged lines, but unmistakably, school bus paint. What they found was horrifying, not because of any single gruesome detail, but because of how well it had been hidden. The bus had somehow become lodged between two boulders during what must have been a slow landslide decades ago. It hadn't crashed so much as been swallowed, camouflaged by time. The windows were mostly shattered. The tires had rotted down to wire. The interior was filled with decay: damp moss, collapsed ceiling fabric, mildew, and soil. But the body itself was shockingly intact, as if it had been entombed. And then they opened the front door. The stench was immediate. Rot layered with time. But something else, too. The sickly, sweet scent of mold and old fabric, like the inside of a forgotten closet. The team wore respirators as they stepped inside. Seats were torn or missing. The aisle was packed with leaves and broken wood. But across the walls and windows were markings. Not graffiti, not vandalism. Children's drawings, crayon, pencil, marker, etched with fingernails into foggy glass. Sunflowers, trees, a dog, what looked like a game of hopscotch. Names were scrawled in handwriting only a child could make out. Most were first names, some were symbols, and then near the back, 3 words written over and over: "Still on the trip." Investigators paused. Photographs were taken, samples collected. Forensics teams brought in portable lighting, carefully lifting each object found. Near the front of the bus, just behind the driver's seat, was a rusted clipboard wedged in place by collapsed seat foam. The paper attached had long since dissolved, but beneath it, tucked into a small crack in the floor, was a plastic bag. It had protected a torn notebook. Most pages were unreadable, but one page, pressed flat in the center, bore a legible note. Day 12. Mr. Harland says stay quiet. We are still waiting for the road to open. The forest is watching. Investigators immediately cross-checked the name. Harland was the last name of the school bus driver from 1985, a man in his mid-40s who had no known criminal record and who disappeared along with the children. Next came the most disturbing discovery. Near the emergency exit in the back, investigators found a plastic lunchbox, its lid partially open. Inside were neatly folded napkins, now stained and brittle, wrapped around a collection of teeth. Human, juvenile. Too clean to be random, they had been placed intentionally. At that point, the site was closed off completely. Authorities released only a basic statement to the public. We have located the missing bus from the 1985 Cedar Creek case. Further investigation is underway. But behind closed doors, the teams reviewing the site knew something wasn't right. The bus was found in a ravine at an elevation no road should have reached. The tree growth around it suggested it had been there for at least 3 decades. And yet the moss on the roof had a growth pattern no more than 10 years old. And strangest of all, the tire grooves in the soil just outside the bus were fresh. As if something heavy had moved, or been moved, in or out. By the end of the week, a special task force reopened the case. They had found what the title promised, but the questions had only multiplied. By the time the discovery hit national headlines, the bus was under full lockdown. Crime scene tape looped around the collapsed trees. Rangers patrolled the perimeter. Drones hovered overhead. Every inch of the vehicle, inside and out, was treated as sacred evidence, not just because of what they'd already found, but because of what might still be hidden. The forensic teams worked in shifts, documenting every detail, every object, every faint trace left behind. And on the first full day of interior excavation, the horror deepened. What they found were human remains, but only partial ones. 7 children, confirmed by size, clothing fragments, and DNA swabs pulled from old toothbrushes still stored by grieving parents. Bones tucked beneath seats, collapsed rib cages caught in rusted hinges, a single shoe, pink Velcro strap still intact, wedged between the driver's seat and the dashboard. But that was the problem. There were 14 children on that bus. 7 bodies? 7 still unaccounted for. This fact alone shattered any theories of a crash or total fatality event. If the bus had simply gone off-road and the children perished, there should have been more, or at least evidence of it. But half the passengers had seemingly disappeared again, or never died here at all. The symbols were the next red flag. They weren't immediately obvious. Some had been faded by weather or buried beneath mildew. But slowly, as more grime was removed and seats pulled up, a pattern emerged. Carvings in the seatbacks, not scribbles, not graffiti, but deliberate. Loops, intersecting lines, some reminiscent of Celtic or pagan runes, others entirely unidentifiable. One seat near the middle had been carved with such force that the vinyl had split and warped the metal beneath it. Beneath the carving, in tiny block letters, someone had etched the words, "We listened." That wasn't the only message. On the rear emergency window, inspectors found the word "waiting" carved from the inside, shaky, uneven, and repeated multiple times. As if someone had tried to say it again and again, as if someone had expected rescue. The stuffed animal, a threadbare stuffed lamb, was found sitting neatly on a back seat, untouched by rot or weather. Around its neck, a friendship bracelet, the kind you make in 3rd grade, with cheap plastic beads and colored string. When cross-referenced with family photos, the bracelet matched one worn by 9-year-old Emily Davison, one of the missing girls. Her hair sample, still clinging to the fabric, confirmed the match, but the most disturbing object was found in the front, inside the glove compartment. Wrapped in an oily rag and duct tape was a cassette tape. A normal 60-minute cassette, dated March 1985. Its label had worn off, but when carefully cleaned and inserted into a restored player, Sound emerged. Static. Then footsteps. A man's voice, calm, tired, begins speaking. March 17th. The children are asleep. That's good. They don't ask questions anymore. He doesn't identify himself, but the voice is soon matched to archival footage from the original case. Alan Harland, the bus driver. The same man who vanished without a trace. In the recording, he sounds increasingly unstable, sometimes slurring, sometimes whispering. He mentions names. Jacob, Tori, Miguel, they're quiet now. They know the forest needs quiet. 35 minutes in, the audio drops out, then resumes with what sounds like music in the background. An old hymn, and over it Harland speaks again. I saw it last night. I thought it was the fog again, but it blinked, right there behind the trees. The tape ends with a single phrase, nearly drowned in static. They said I could leave, but not them. The implications were chilling. The driver had not only survived for a time, he had been keeping the children alive, somewhere, somehow, until something changed. Or until someone, or something, stopped them from leaving. When investigators reviewed the entire tape, they realized something else. A faint hum in the background. Rhythmic, low, repeating. Sound engineers isolated it and determined it was not mechanical, not natural. It was too patterned, too precise, almost like a chant or a beacon. And the date written on the cassette? March 17th, 1986. 1 year after the bus vanished, someone had still been alive. What happened in that forest for an entire year? Who or what had kept them from returning? There were no further answers that day, only more dread, more silence, and the realization that something had started long before the discovery, and was far from over. When the forensics team discovered the tape, they were expecting documentation, maybe even a confession. What they weren't prepared for was how personal the audio felt. How it didn't just reveal what happened, it confessed something unspoken, something bigger than missing children, something deeper, ancient, terrifying. The tape begins in static, but the voice is unmistakably the same man from the earlier cassette. Alan Harland, the bus driver. But now he's different. Before, he was calm, measured. This time he's whispering, words sharp, clipped. There's tension in his breathing, the kind you only hear when someone is trying not to panic. The first sentence comes through like a secret being pulled from a well. We weren't supposed to go down that road. It wasn't there before. Silence follows. Except for the sound of heavy breathing and what might be rain or wind brushing against the microphone. Then a soft, metallic clink, like keys trembling in someone's hand. The fog got worse. Couldn't see 5 feet ahead. Thought I missed the turn. Radio stopped working. Couldn't get the school, couldn't get anyone. He stops again. You can hear his hands shaking against something, maybe the steering wheel. He continues. Kids started getting scared. Tori was crying. Miguel said he saw someone out the window. But we were in the middle of nowhere. No roads, just trees. The panic is real now. His voice speeds up. Then they started hearing things, voices from the woods, calling their names, saying stuff only I should know. Then he breaks. His voice cracks. The audio wobbles with some kind of interference, static that pulses with a strange rhythm, almost like it's mimicking breath. And then, one kid, I think it was Jenny, said she saw her mom in the trees, just standing there, smiling. But it wasn't her. It couldn't have been her. Another pause. You can hear him shifting in his seat. The creak of worn leather. Then they started leaving. The silence after that line is longer than anything else on the tape. One by one, they just got up and went outside. I told them to sit down. I screamed at them, but they didn't even look at me. They walked out into the fog. A full minute of silence follows, the kind of silence that has weight to it. You can hear the soft whine of the wind through cracked glass, a strange echoing thump, like someone walking on metal far off in the background. Then the voice returns, hoarse and dry. I locked the doors, sat in the front seat, waited all night. And in the morning, they came back. Another long silence. Then his final words, quieter than anything before. But they weren't the same. The tape clicks off. The room the investigators were in fell completely silent, too. It was one of those moments where no one wanted to be the first to speak, as if doing so would give what they'd just heard more power. Something about the recording felt wrong, not just eerie, unsettling on a level that couldn't be explained. Experts analyzed the audio for signs of tampering or hallucination. They couldn't find anything inconsistent. The voice was consistent with Harlan's known speech patterns. The location noise matched the environment the bus was found in. But that wasn't what haunted people. It was what wasn't on the tape. Where had the children gone? What had they followed? And why had they returned? Different. A psychologist on the case made a chilling observation. This kind of collective behavior, if true, borders on mass delusion or something we don't yet understand. These weren't frightened children fleeing a crash. These were kids, obeying. Worse still. A spectral analyst noticed the strange audio hum in the background of the tape, a pattern that, when isolated and looped, produced a low-frequency tone known to cause unease in humans. The so-called fear frequency. Coincidence? Maybe. But investigators were now split. Half believed Harlan had suffered a breakdown, that he was losing grip on reality, that he let the kids wander into the woods and invented a story to justify what happened next. But the other half, including a few hardened FBI agents, weren't so sure, because on the next tape they would hear something else, something not human. But before that came to light, a chilling discovery was made beneath the bus itself. A burial mound. Small, precisely stacked rocks arranged into a spiral. Inside, no bones, no items. Just soil and a strip of cloth tied in a knot. A child's sock. They tested it. It belonged to one of the missing children. Not one of the 7 whose remains were found. One of the other 7. That meant at least one of the missing children had been under that bus at some point, but still not found. The story was no longer just about disappearance. It was something else now, something that whispered of possession, of influence, of something old and deeply wrong in those woods. Harlan had seen it. The kids had followed it. And the ones who came back weren't alone. In the weeks that followed the rediscovery of the school bus, the area was swarmed by journalists, by federal agents, by grieving family members who had lived with uncertainty for 40 years. But now, everything focused on a single burning question. If 7 sets of remains were found on the bus, where were the other 7? The forest was combed again, thoroughly. The terrain was rough, uneven hills, collapsing gullies, thick with underbrush that had grown wild for decades. Search parties used ground-penetrating radar, dogs, and drones to scan every inch of the surrounding 2-mile radius. At first, they found nothing. No clothing fragments, no bones, no signs of shelter or grave sites. Some began to speculate. Maybe the children had simply gotten lost, perished in the wild. Their remains consumed by time, erosion, and animals. A sad but explainable ending. But then, a ranger named Elijah Mendez noticed something strange on a topographic map. A low depression area, covered in shadows even at high noon, deep in the valley. It wasn't on any tourist routes. No signage. just an empty curve tucked under a cluster of rock formations that locals referred to as the Hush Stones, a name no one could really explain. The next morning, a 3-person team hiked out to investigate. What they found would turn the entire case on its head. About 2 miles from the location of the bus, down a trail barely visible under pine needles and broken limbs, was the mouth of a small cave, hidden behind an outcrop of granite. Inside, it was colder than the surrounding forest, unusually so, and the air carried a strange metallic scent, like old blood and rust. They found no bodies, but what was inside chilled them to the core. The cave walls were covered in drawings, crude but unmistakable depictions of children, 14 stick figures, some grouped together, some alone. Above them, in several of the drawings, were large eye-shaped symbols. Some of the children had red X's drawn over their heads. In one particularly disturbing section of wall, the drawing had changed. The children were older now, their arms longer, their eyes blank. One of the figures was reaching toward a shape that resembled the bus, and near the center of the wall, a handprint. It was tiny, no bigger than a 6-year-old's, but it was fresh, preserved in some kind of charcoal or soot. They photographed it, sampled it, and ran the DNA through the National Missing Persons database. It matched one of the 7 children whose remains had not been found. The news broke the next day. Cave may hold clues to missing bus children. But even before the press could get to it, something stranger happened, something no one could explain. A local reporter, Ingrid Voss, who had covered the original disappearance back in 1985 and stayed in the area ever since, received an envelope. No return address, just her name written in blocky black ink. Inside, there was a single Polaroid photo. It showed 3 young adults, early 20s, standing in the clearing of a forest, near an old wooden sign that read, "Ravenwood Path, no access beyond this point." The faces in the photo were partially shadowed. 2 wore hoodies. One had a scarf pulled up to cover most of their face, but the third was clearer, not enough to identify absolutely, but just enough to suggest something deeply disturbing. They were wearing a red backpack with patches along the top, one of which was the logo of the 1985 elementary school the children had attended. That backpack had belonged to Liam Petrie, one of the missing boys. His parents had kept a photo of him wearing it on the morning of the trip. It was an exact match. There were 2 more things in the envelope. A note scrawled in uneven handwriting that said, "You only found part of the truth. We are still out here, watching." And below it, what appeared to be GPS coordinates, leading to a region that had long been considered off-limits due to fire risk and unstable terrain. The reporter turned everything over to the FBI. But the photo? The note? They were never seen again. When asked by the media about the contents of the envelope, Voss would only say this: "Someone wants us to know they're alive, or at least something is." Conspiracy theories exploded overnight. Reddit threads filled with speculation. TikToks dissected the backpack, trying to analyze the stitching patterns and compare them to old class photos. Was it the real one? Was the person wearing it one of the children, now grown up? Or was it someone else? Someone who had found the backpack, or taken it? A new theory began to emerge, one more terrifying than all the others. What if the children never left the forest? What if they'd been changed, raised, conditioned by someone, or something? The cave drawings, the photos, the whispers on the tapes. Too many pieces were falling into place, and none of them felt natural. The case was officially reopened in early October 2025. Press conferences were held. The local sheriff's department admitted with visible discomfort that the original investigation had overlooked anomalies. Journalists grilled them about the recovered tapes, the handprint in the cave, and the mysterious photo, but answers remained elusive. Most of the files were now in federal hands, and behind that wall, only silence. What came next was unexpected, an apology. 40 years too late, the school district where it all began issued a formal statement of regret to the families of the 14 children who vanished on that fateful trip. There were words like tragedy, failure, and deep sorrow. But for the parents who had lived with empty bedrooms and unanswered birthdays, no apology would ever be enough. A memorial was held on the school grounds, the first official one since 1985. Dozens attended. 7 caskets, 7 nameplates. Flowers were laid down, speeches were given. But even among the mourners, whispers floated. This wasn't closure. Not really. Not with 7 children still unaccounted for. Not with photos appearing in mailboxes and drawings etched into cave walls miles from any trail. One mother, Evelyn Petrie, stood by her son's marker and refused to cry. She simply said, "He's not in there. I'd feel it if he was." But time moves on, even when the past won't let go. 2 weeks after the memorial, a school bus stop on the edge of a neighboring town, once a route used by the same school in the 80s, became the scene of a strange report. The security footage showed fog rolling in unnaturally fast that morning, too thick for late October. The streetlights flickered, and visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Only one student was waiting, a 10-year-old girl named Lucy Raymond. In her statement, she said she had been listening to music on her phone, half asleep, when she noticed something odd. She looked up and saw headlights glowing in the fog, but she heard nothing. No engine, no tires, no gravel crunching under weight. Just silence. The lights blinked once, then twice. She thought it might be the bus. She stood up, and then the lights were gone, as if they had never been there. She sat back down, heart racing. She looked around. The fog hadn't lifted. Then something else caught her attention. A piece of paper, fluttering by her feet, carried by the breeze. It looked old, weathered. She bent to pick it up. Scrawled in uneven handwriting, with letters too childlike to be an adult's, were the words, "We're still here." Investigators were called. The footage confirmed her story. The fog, the lights, the moment she picked up the paper. What the footage didn't show was where the paper had come from. No one had been nearby. No other vehicles had passed. The road was empty both before and after the event. And Lucy? She didn't take the bus that day. Her parents drove her to school. She hasn't taken the bus since. Online, the video went viral. Grainy footage of the blinking lights and a child's quiet stare into the mist. Comment sections filled with speculation. Ghost bus? Hoax? Parallel reality? TikTok sleuths tried to decode the handwriting, comparing it to the original triplets' schoolwork, which had recently surfaced in archived files. But those who had followed the case since the beginning, those who remembered the lost 14, the rusted mirror in the tree, the tapes, the cave drawings, the photo in the woods, they weren't looking for answers. They were listening for a sound. A soft engine, a squeak of brakes, the whisper of old tires pulling up one final time. And somewhere, deep in that national forest, perhaps where no road should exist, a bus still waits. Headlights dimmed, windows fogged, and a silence pressing in on all sides. Maybe the children grew up. Maybe they never did. Maybe they're still there, waiting for the next one to climb aboard. Because the paper didn't say, "I'm still here." It said, "We," cut to black.